Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to you all for joining us this evening. This is the usual SJT webinar that we do here. We do these webinars roughly once every 1 to 2 weeks, and I do a lot of them, which I find extremely enjoyable. And I do it a lot based on popular demand because SJT is such an extremely annoying part of the MSRA preparation. I sat the MSRA exam myself in January of this year, and now I started my radiology training in London. So I know how extremely intense this time of year can be for everyone joining us today. So the point of today's webinar is we go through important rules of SJT questions that tend to come up in the exam that have come up in recent years, and how do we tackle questions based on them. Now, MSRA exam, of course, everyone already knows this, is made up of two parts. We have the clinical part and the SJT part. Both of them are quite time strenuous. So SJT, we have around 1 minute and 50 seconds per question, whereas clinical, we have around 45 seconds per question. 1 minute and 50 seconds per question for SJT is extremely tight. That is not a lot of time. You do need to practice questions under pressure in the last few weeks leading up to the exam. I'm just going to spend just 5 minutes going through some things to remind you guys about clinical revision before I start the SJT part. So, revising for the clinical part of the MSRA exam. It's an exam that's heavily textbook and guideline based. Because it's designed to be taken during F2, they don't expect anyone sitting the exam to have immense clinical experience. So the answers do not come from your clinical experience, they come from your knowledge of the guidelines. Meaning, the better you know the NICE guidelines, the better you will perform in this exam. If you know the guidelines off by heart, there is no room for error, essentially, which is a much nicer exam to sit, of course, because you know the guidelines, you will know the answer, but that does place heavier emphasis on strong revision over a longer period of time because learning the guidelines can be heavy. So, please make sure that whatever MSRA resource you are using, that the information is taken directly from the NICE guidelines. The second thing is that it is heavily recall based, which means the same sort of information and conditions do repeat year on year. So with enough revision and practice, you will start to develop patterns of the types of conditions that tend to come up in the exam. 50% of the exam is, of course, SJT, so please do not ignore this component of the exam, and there is, of course, no negative marking. Now, just important things to mention about the clinical questions. The stems are short. MSRA clinical questions tend to be 2 to 4 lines long. Most of the time, they're just 2 lines long. They're not questions packed with information about the history, you know, past hospital attendances, long blood test results, not long examination findings. That's more MRCP style. They tend to be very short and snappy, and they expect you to get to the right answer from minimal amount of detail, which means your revision for clinical components should be focused on breadth rather than depth. I've said this loads of times before. So it's more important that you know how the important signs and symptoms, first line investigation, first line management for everything, rather than focusing on knowing second, third line, fourth line treatment for a select few conditions. It's likely you'll get one question on 100+ topics. So you need to have a good level of knowledge that's not too deep, but a good level of knowledge on most conditions. It's very guideline based, I already said this, and the high yield recall based conditions tend to come up again and again. Think especially GP based conditions and frontline A&E conditions like asthma, diabetes, acne, A&E presenting conditions do tend to come up more often in the MSRA exam. So this is what an MSRA question looks like. 43-year-old woman presents with sudden onset dizziness that persisted and does not improve with rest. She also reports hearing loss in her left ear. 1 week prior, she had a coryzal illness. Very short, snappy, straight to the point, and they expect you to get to the right answer. So it's more important when you're studying for clinical conditions that you are learning the buzzwords and how to differentiate conditions from each other, rather than focusing on learning secondary care type of management that wouldn't come up in the exam, since the MSRA, as we all know, focuses on GP-based conditions. So very short stem with no fluff. Something like this, which is a much longer stem with a bit more of the past medical history, there's some examination findings, there's some imaging findings, is unlikely to be an MSRA style question. That's more MRCP style. I'm just pointing this out so that when you are studying, now that we are in the last few weeks leading up to the exam, you don't end up wasting your time doing longer questions that can be overloaded with red flag clues and can give a false image that the exam is actually easier than in real life, because I think doing a question like this one is much more challenging than doing a longer question packed with red flag clues. So please focus on important signs and symptoms, first line investigation, first line management.